Hello out there in Radio Land. On this week's episode of Kruegerecords, my guest should be familiar to you composers fans out there since he's one of our most regular and requested guests. Andy Sell is a Minnesota-based comic and podcaster responsible for co-hosting a variety of horror and music-themed podcasts, including Ghoul School, Pod the Life, $3 Pod Y'all, and Heart-Shaped Pod, all available on the Unpopular Opinion Network, as well as his personal show, Look Good for the Boys. He's a musician, a scholar, a gentleman, and one of my favorite guests we've ever had, and today, he's brought a record for us to listen to. Tune your guitars to a wildly impractical key, friends, because this is Kruegerecords. Welcome to Composers Kruegerecords, an exclusive Patreon series where my musically inclined guests take me and you on a deep dive into their favorite albums, artists, and songs. I'm your host, but you already know that, so let's get into the important part. As you heard in the intro, my guest today is music and horror maven, my friend and yours, Mr. Andy Sell. And I got to tell you, Andy, having you on this show is one of the reasons I started it. So I'm really, really excited to have you here today.
Oh, wow. That's really nice.
I've been listening to you talk about music for a number of years now. I mentioned in the bumper that you've done a lot of different music podcasts and stuff like that. And one of the things that always struck me when I heard you on those shows was that you have your knowledge of, our listeners will know you for your knowledge of horror because you come on and talk and give us like lessons on horror movies, which is dope. But listening to you on your other shows, it's very clear that you have a really robust understanding of a lot of music that a lot of people have not heard. And I figured that made you just a perfect candidate to be on this show. Cause like, that's the whole idea. I want to listen to eclectic stuff. And boy, I've been on a bit of a journey and this is continuing it. I'm really excited.
Thanks.
So before we get into your album, can you tell us a little bit about your musical background and your musical taste?
Well, it's funny. You say that I know stuff that is maybe kind of more obscure, and it's like to the detriment of my ability to relate to other people often. Like I find a lot of times I'll be in a conversation and someone will bring up a song or an artist and I'll be like, I don't know what that is. And they'll be like, where were you in 2003? And I'll be like, I guess I was dead. I don't know. I was at a Page 99 show. Probably. I was out like seeing this band that like you definitely haven't heard of, but so I miss out on a lot of stuff, but I would say that my musical taste is pretty eclectic and kind of, I don't know. I want to say always has been like, I got into a lot of punk music maybe later, I think, than most people do age-wise. What
are we talking?
Well, like late high school is when I started getting into a lot of like hardcore and punk music. And then, I was into like the bands we're talking about today and the bands of that scene I was into like when they were around. It wasn't like after they broke up or whatever, I heard about them. Like I was in that, but I was also in my early 20s. And I feel like, well, I don't know, they were all in their early 20s too, making that music. So it's, I feel like sometimes, I say I was into punk music, but it's like, I don't know, not till I was 17. I was a little late to grunge too, even though I was 11 when Smells Like Teen Spirit hit.
Yeah, but that's endemic to being a weird age because you're not far off of my age. I was 10 when Kurt died, and all my friends are like 6 years older than me. So I felt like I didn't miss the grunge era because I came to it later, but I was introduced to it in the same way that someone experiencing it the first time would have been, where they were like, okay, we're going to start at the beginning, listen to this, listen to In Utero, listen to whatever. Or, with the Pumpkins, it was the same thing. Don't start with Siamese Dream, go all the way back to Pisces Iscariot or whatever. And but it does take you out of the experience a little bit. And I wanted to ask a bit about that because you mentioned that you came to it later in life. Who brought you there, or was it just you?
So it was, I mean, a lot of it can be chalked up to a friend of mine named Jeff, who I lived with. I lived in like a punk party house in college for a section of time on a street in Santa Fe called Calle Lorca.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of a notorious house. It's where parties were for years and years and years and years, like to the point where at one point when I lived there, we had to make a rule because the house had a legacy and people would show up, on like a weeknight, just expecting there to be something going on. And we'd be like, well, we're going to bed.
Yeah, it's Wednesday at 10 p.m. We're college students.
Yeah.
This is not Animal House. Like,
yeah, we don't even have a Greek system at this school. What are you doing?
Yeah.
Why did you show up with a keg without texting any of us? Which happened, I think, more than once. But Jeff was the cool guy roommate who was into everything before it was a thing. Like, he was the first person I knew of that knew about the Strokes. He was the first person I knew of that knew about Interpol. Like, he would show up with some band, some like tape or CD or something and be like, no, you got to check this out. These guys are going to be huge. And like, sure enough, like months later, everybody would be all over them.
So you had your own personal A&R guy is what you're telling me.
Yeah. And he was like super, I mean, to the point where he's actually mentioned in the special thanks in the liner notes of a Blood Brothers record.
No shit.
Yeah. Because he just knows everybody and he's into every scene. And he was a punk kid and a hardcore kid. And he and I were in a band together. And like, he was the guy that got me into this. I was already kind of like, my musical journey was sort of like when I was young, it was like I was into jazz and oldies and soul and like a little bit of country here and there. But like, then in high school, grunge happened. I was into grunge. And then I was into like, I got really into like disco and like
disco, really
90s electronica stuff, like the club shit. And
like Love Inc. shit like that sort of like
Snap and Technotronic.
Okay, yeah, okay, sure.
Utah Saints,
Oh wow.
But then later in high school, like junior year, I started getting more back into metal. And I mean, I was into Guns N' Roses when they were around, but that was sort of the last before grunge changed everything.
Well, yeah.
And, but I started to get back, like I got into like Marilyn Manson and White Zombie and like the proto nu metal, I guess, the post-industrial metal. And then punk and ska and swing, of course. I just kind of
oh yeah, we all got into swing for like 8 minutes. I forgot about that.
Yeah, and I was like a tiny bit ahead of the curve on that, just because I was already into jazz. So I was I was swing dancing before it was in.
I mean, and you owned a zoot suit, right? Like it was already in your closet. So
yeah, I actually literally did own a zoot suit.
Oh, you're kidding? I was kidding.
No, I'm dead serious.
That's amazing.
Fire engine red zoot suit.
Holy shit, that's incredible.
So. But then Jeff was the guy that kind of got me into, like, I remember the first thing he played for me was Majority Rule. And that was kind of like the song XOXO off the album Interviews with David Frost was the song that sort of like blew my mind. Was just like, oh, holy fucking shit. Like, this is my music. Like I knew what it was like to feel music and to love music, but like this was sort of like the first time I think that it was like, this is made for you. Like right. this was made for exactly you. And it was a lot of the punk that I had been into was more about the lyrical content before. This was like, whoa, you can do interesting stuff with instrumentation in aggressive music. Like it can be metal and punk, but also like jammy. What? Like that. So that was sort of how I got into I guess this would be the Virginia, DC screamo scene of the late 90s, early 2000s.
Okay.
And it was a huge scene. And there were we didn't really call it screamo at the time. Now it's called screamo and scrams and all this stuff. But it was like, we just called it hardcore or melodic hardcore or even punk.
I've heard melodic hardcore as a term. This is, I was saying off mic, this is not my wheelhouse at all. And there are like 1,000 subgenres of this.
Oh, there's so much. I can't even keep track of it anymore. But the scene that was going on in Virginia, DC at the time, that was like, there were a ton of labels and a ton of bands, and all these guys were in each other's bands and starting new bands. And they would put out like a 7-inch or a split, and then like one EP or one full length, and then that was it. And they'd start another band with 2 other guys from a different band. And it was just this very like cool sort of scene. I was in the desert at the time. I was in New Mexico. So I was sort of watching all of this from afar, but they would tour, and we'd have the bands play shows, and our bands would play shows with their bands. And it was just, I don't know. It was that music, that scene's music was such a mind-opening thing for me.
It's interesting to hear you talk about it, because my introduction to punk was actually old punk, was like late 70s punk. Like my introduction was like, the Clash and Black Flag and, the UK Subs and that kind of like the British side and the DC side and all that stuff, due to a friend of the show, Brent Chittenden, who's my other music guru that I rely on all the time. And I hear a lot of the same sentiments, and particularly when you mentioned that these guys are all in one another's bands. I mean, one of my favorite things to listen to is punk wise is Henry Rollins' Get in the Van spoken word record, which I think is very illuminating about that period of time, even though it's a very subjective story, obviously told by a very misanthropic man. But when he talked about, oh yeah, we did this, and then we performed as this band over here with like 2 members of that band and a guy from this band over here, and we kind of did one show and that was it. And so how much do you think that the scene that you're referring to, so like that DC kind of Virginia post, like screamo, if you want to call it that, like how much do you think that is sort of that 25-year cycle happening again, and how much do you think it's like original to the time and place? Because of course we're now talking about in and around the post 9/11 era and the very recent post 9/11 era, which I can't imagine would have had an influence as well.
Yeah, it was, it definitely was kind of like, I don't know, there one of the labels, Level Plane, that put out a bunch of Page 99 stuff, and they were working on a document, or maybe it was Robotic Empire, but they were working on a documentary at one point called Documenting Page 99, which is funny because all of Page 99's releases are called Document. Their document number is the name of all their releases. But it never got finished. And I don't know if it's still in development or production. It's something that they've been talking about for literally like a decade and a half now, at least.
Yeah.
And it's just like, I would love to see that, because I want to know more about what these folks have to say about where it came from and where it started. And I'm sure there's articles and there's interviews I've read, but I kind of want a clearer picture of how this came to be. But it was, from what I understand, it's like DC is also one of the big hubs for punk rock. And it's where like the 81 hardcore scene started. It's where Discord started. Like,
yeah.
And I feel like the Northern Virginia scene was sort of, like a 15 to 20 years later, now as we're getting an echo of that, but in a more kind of like maybe rural environment than what you would see like straight up District of Columbia, Washington, DC, Maryland. Like now we're kind of a little bit more out in the boonies, but not really. I mean, like, this scene was in Richmond, and, a lot of parts of North Carolina had bands that contributed to this scene as well. So like I don't know, I think I lost my thread a little bit, but I think, it's now we definitely, like a lot of bands in the last 10 years have been sort of picking up the torch from the DCVA scene of the late 90s, early aughts, with bands like Touche Amore and Pianos Become the Teeth and Modern Life is War has been around for a really long time. But there's more bands doing this kind of stuff. And also a lot of these bands are doing reunion shows, not so much now, but they were in the last 10 years doing reunion tours and reunion shows and reunion releases. And like, I saw City of Caterpillar in 2016 in LA. I saw Majority Rule in 2017, I think, in LA, with Page 99. And yeah, so I've lost the thread, but I do think that we are seeing kind of like a little bit, there's a lot of bands like Gulch. Unfortunately, Gulch just broke up, but they're incredible. They're another incredible, like, newer band doing this kind of stuff. And I also, sometimes I'm just an old guy and I'm like, I want to listen to the stuff that I like. And sure, if there's a new band doing it, I love to hear about it. But for some reason, I'm like missing out on a lot of it for some reason.
That makes sense. Well, I mean, and I felt like I missed out on a lot of that scene as well, because it's something that I've come to discover mostly through listening to you talk about bands like Page 99 and indeed City of Caterpillar. Because this was again today, even now, having experienced some of that at that time, Poison the Well, From Autumn to Ashes, bands like that. Like that I kind of dipped my toe into.
Yeah, there were like bands like From Autumn to Ashes, which is more metal, but like Poison the Well too is a definitely, like, I think they were called screamo right away. I think
so.
Like the bigger bands that were in that kind of milieu or that like genre space. A lot of these DC, VA, and that area bands were kind of like, involved with them as well.
So that's a good segue, because I want to talk about this record. So what did you bring for us today?
So this is City of Caterpillar's 2002 self-titled full length. Their only full length, their only LP, unless you count the demo and live release, which, I mean, it's not a studio album, so no. But it's also great. I mean, I don't think there's a City of Caterpillar release I don't love. But yeah, so their 2002 self-titled full length.
And they were part of this scene. They were part of the scene that you were just talking about, because normally my follow-up to that is this in line with what you usually enjoy? And it sounds like, yes, in fact, it might be foundational to what you usually enjoy.
Yeah. This is kind of this band and this record, because it's their only studio album release, it is foundational. It does get compared to things a lot. Like when I start listening to something new, and at least in this, metal punk space, and post rock too. That's the other thing, is that City of Caterpillar embraced post rock in a band in a way that wasn't super typical of bands in this musical area.
It certainly sounds that way. I did a little bit of reading on these guys today, because I've listened to this record before, because you recommended it on one of the Unpops shows. You brought up City of Caterpillar, and I checked it out because you and I had a conversation about it. I was like, oh, I'm going to go listen to this. And I did, and I really liked it. What can you tell me about this band that we haven't kind of already covered, in the sense that we've covered the milieu in which they existed? Because it strikes me like you seem to be, like, if I didn't know better, I'd say these guys.
Yeah, and I actually know a couple of them. Like I've met them personally. Like, I mean, we're not friends. We don't keep up with each other. Occasionally, Chris Taylor from Page 99 and I will have an interaction on Twitter or something. But yeah, I don't know any of these guys personally, but like I've met a number of them. What I can tell you about them, like they started in 2000, around the same time as a lot of these other bands: Majority Rule, Darkest Hour, Page 99, Stop It, Enemy Soil. And they share members with a lot of these groups, because a lot, like I said, this scene, it was full of this kind of a thing of like guys being in multiple bands with each other.
Yeah, I got confused about that today when we were talking, because I was looking up the album, and I had a moment where I was like, oh no, have I been listening to the wrong thing this entire time? Because there was another band that was them, that was elements of them in Page 99. And I can't remember the name of the band.
Well, there's a number of them. There's Malady.
Malady was the one that I found, and I went, oh shit, is this one I'm supposed to be listening to?
I mean, you should. It's great.
I mean, I should, yes.
That's the other thing, is that like all the bands that these folks have gone on to start, I've seen also. Like I've seen Ghastly City Sleep at least, I think, twice now. I've seen Malady once. I didn't see Verse and Coma, because nobody did, because I don't think they ever went on tour. But a number of bands that have been associated with this band I have seen live, and have listened to and bought releases from a number of those other bands that came after. So in that way, I feel like I know them, but just because of like, you release music for, 20 years or whatever, and I'm listening to all of it, but it's not parasocial or anything, but I can tell you that, like, okay, Kevin from this band who played bass in this band, he played in Majority Rule, and Majority Rule played a show with my band for my birthday once in Santa Fe.
Really? And what was your band?
This was the one and only performance of the band We Be Knives. And it was a shit show, but Majority Rule were amazing. Majority Rule were amazing. Mm-hmm. And they're always amazing. And yeah, Kevin was in that band, and Pat, the drummer, he's the drummer for City of Caterpillar when they're on tour. Their regular drummer is Ryan Parrish from Darkest Hour for recording. He's their recording drummer.
Right.
But I believe every time I've seen them live, Pat's been the drummer. Maybe in 2016 it was somebody else. I have a funny story about Pat too. On that Majority Rule show, where he was looking for weed. He really wanted some weed.
Is this a story that you're going to get in trouble for telling, or is this? Okay?
I don't know if it's okay or not. I mean, it was 20 years ago, so I imagine he can just be like, yeah, I smoked weed before I played, whatever.
Yeah.
But
okay.
He got really, a friend of mine hooked him up with some weed, and he got so fucking stoned.
Oh no.
And it's crazy because, I smoke weed, and I do think can be productive. Mm-hmm. But it's amazing to me, like, musicians that can get super high, or comedians too. I know some comedians like this. They can get super high, and then they're just in some kind of fucking zone. Mm-hmm. And Pat's drumming, if you listen to Majority Rule, probably a little more so than City of Caterpillar, you will, like, it's ferocious. And it's great drumming in City of Caterpillar, but you're not going to hear Pat on this record because Ryan Parrish was the drummer.
Yeah.
But, like, it's ferocious, vicious, evil drumming. It's amazing. And I don't know how he can be that tight and that, like, vicious.
Isn't it bizarre?
With his drums while he's that high. Like, we went to a restaurant, and there was this painting of a turtle on the wall, and he was just like, I fucking love that turtle, man. He's like, I want that turtle. I want that turtle in my house.
A friend of mine who I won't call out because that wouldn't be fair, but he's easily one of the best guitar players I've ever had the good fortune to play with. His band was playing here in Toronto, and we showed up to see them play. I brought a bunch of people because I was like, you got to see this band, real tight three-piece rock outfit. And the front man guy is my buddy, and he played the whole set, and he's doing all this fun stuff playing behind his head, all the showmanship shit that he knows everybody likes. And all the fretwork's incredible and so on. And then he gets done. All right, we're going to take a break. We're going to have a beer. We'll be back in a little bit. And falls face first off the stage. And I was like, Jesus, what? And I nearly said his name. I was, Jesus, what happened? And he was like, oh, I had like 8 pints and 2 joints before I even got up here. And I was like, you monster.
I still have a buddy who gives me shit about an open mic I did in Gainesville, Florida one night where I was blacked out. I don't remember a single thing I said.
Oh no.
And he's like, that's the best. That's the funniest you've ever been. It was your best. And I'm like, don't tell me that.
No.
Because I don't drink, and I'm not going to again. Mm-hmm. But there's a lie. Also, you're drunk. You're lying to me. Like, there's no way that was that good a set. I was blacked out.
It all comes out in the wash. It's like, what was I good, or were you just as drunk as me?
Yeah, I mean, it's subjective, but
so speaking of subjective, can you tell me a little bit about the first time you heard? I don't know whether you heard the record first, or you heard them live first. With you, it could go either way.
It would have been the record first. Because that was the other thing, man. You would see a band that you wanted to go see because of, they were part of this scene, so you bought their record because it's one member of Crestfallen and one member of Triac or whatever. I don't know. Like, it would be like, yeah, the members of this band are in this band, so I'm going to buy their release, and it's amazing. And then you go see them live, and then you see some local band you'd never heard of, or like some band that's local to that scene that you drove 2 hours to go see.
Right, and they're the opener or whatever,
and you're like, wow, these guys are amazing too. Like, so yeah, that happened a lot. But the first time I heard City of Caterpillar, it was the record. And it was like how I heard a lot of stuff, where I would be at home and Jeff would be like, hey man, you got to check this out. And I'd go into his room and he'd put on a song, and I'd be like, this is my new everything,
Right.
And And I'm pretty sure the first time I heard City of Caterpillar was this record. It was the opening track, was the first thing I heard from them. And you're wondering how a top floor could replace Heaven.
Yeah, thank you. I was just about to look it up because it's one of those, and I can see why they're kind of called proto emo, because all of their song titles are almost as long as their songs, which are 9 minutes long. So I was just like, oh yeah, I remember this.
This is aesthetic. Like when people talk about like, oh yeah, your band name is really long and your song title is really long. like this is the band they're talking about, you know?
For sure.
It was like a door inside of myself that had been shut my whole life, opening up and me being like, oh my God, like this is for me. This is my thing.
Do you think that's a you thing, or do you think that's something that they had that influence on a lot of people? Because my next question is usually what makes this record great. And I think for you, it's this door opening, but I'm curious what that means and whether you think it's a shared experience or individual to you.
I mean, I think it's a shared experience. I think there's probably a number of people who can say that about this band and this record specifically. Like I was already into the scene a little bit by the time I'd heard this, but you know, and I love Majority Rule. And honestly, that Majority Rule was the first band where it was like, fuck, you know, like this aggressive, loud, heavy, hard music can also be really long and really and have like jammy parts to it and and get groovy at times. Like, and that's, I think what it was like that specific kind of combination of elements that, you know, a lot of times you go to a hardcore show and it's like, yeah, this band, all of their songs are 2 minutes long. They're all just straight ahead and then they're done. And it's screaming and it's fun and you feel the percussiveness and you feel the storm inside you, you know, but then it's over. And this was one of those bands where it's like, no, we're seeing where the storm goes, you know, where it's like, we're going to get a little dancey with it. It's going to be a little cool. Like there's where it's aggressive and there's screaming, but also like there's a sweetness to it and there's a dynamic to it. And there's a kind of dichotomy of restraint and release going on.
Yes, it's something that I noticed because when I was listening through the album today, one of many listens that I've taken to this, but when I was listening to it today with a little bit of a more critical ear, like I said, this was not my wheelhouse growing up, so I don't have a lot within the scene to compare it to. But what it did remind me of very strongly was 9 Inch Nails. And
oh wow,
and like mid-range, like late 90s, like the Fragile era 9 Inch Nails, where he was doing those big, long, like melodic pieces that would grow and build and then fade out and then grow and build again, something I Could Never Have, or like The Great Below, or you know, tracks like that where it's, and I noticed the Ebb and Flow Tool came to mind as well for obvious reasons, where it's these big sort of epic pieces of art almost. And this is another question that I have to ask you. Do you think these big, long, 9-minute long melodic, multiple key changes and time signature changes, do you think that's endemic to this genre or series of genres? Because it's not something that I recognize anywhere other than maybe jazz or like opera.
Yeah,
outside of this.
It's funny because I was just going to say, like, why this speaks to me and why I think there's other people it speaks to is because I can't imagine that I'm the only angry poetry loving kid who also was in jazz band.
Yeah.
Like, you know, there is something jazzy about it, but it's also like Sonic Youth or Godspeed You Black Emperor, in that there are these there are these post-rock compositional elements to the instrumentation and this kind of sprawl to it, and this let's noodle or follow a thread and see where it goes and then bring it back. It is jazz. It's very jazz, but it's also very Sonic Youth and very like, I don't want to say this because I've said this to people before and been yelled at for it, but there's a Pearl Jamness to it as well.
I'm not going to disagree with that.
And I was
like to shit on Pearl Jam, but I know what you mean.
I was also a Radiohead guy, and I have this whole thing about
the
how
through line there, that makes perfect sense.
You can learn a lot about a person. I used to say this obnoxious thing, and I'm going to say it now. I don't know if I still believe it because whatever. Nothing is a character test, but you can tell things about a person by what their favorite Radiohead album is.
I think you're right.
Mine was always Pablo Honey. And I know that's an unpopular take, but it's because that was to a song being like for me in the way that this scene's music was for me. Like there was an anger about it. Reminiscent, of course, obviously at the time of Nirvana, but they didn't sustain, you know what I mean? Like they got more ponderous and that's not bad. I love Radiohead. Don't get me wrong. Yeah,
but you listen to Kid A and listen to Pablo. Those are two different, because actually that's my favorite Radiohead record too, oddly.
Wait, really? Pablo Honey?
It's Pablo Honey, believe it or not. Yeah. Because my interest in them started with that and stopped with the Bends. Because I like the Bends too. The Bends is a good record too, but I could see kind of, because there are some killer tracks on there. Just is great, Fake Plastic Trees. But after that, I was like, I heard Paranoid Android and I went, oh, this is what you're doing. Okay, I see where this is going. And I kind of jumped ship a little bit. I went back and listened to like Amnesiac, and it's Amnesiac, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Kid A and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I found value in it later, but to me, it was like it was a different band.
Yeah, when they won me back, I think was Hail to the Thief. I really love Hail to the Thief.
Hail to the Thief was a very good record. I was
record.
surprised how much I liked that record, actually.
Yeah, it honestly might be my second favorite Radiohead album, but which again, not a popular thing. You don't have the Bends in your top two. Everyone thinks you're an asshole, but
yeah.
But so there was this Radiohead element to it as well. If they had stayed angry and maybe started doing Sonic Youth shit, like. That's kind of, I guess, the sort of pithy thing to say maybe about City of Caterpillar and the stuff that I enjoyed in it. And it is a thing that started being more a part of this kind of music. And I don't know how much City of Caterpillar were to credit for that. Probably at least to some significant degree.
Well, I was about to ask because like on our main show, we used to do this dumb scorecard, which you remember, where we would arbitrarily assign numbers to things. And one of our categories was cultural importance. And I'm curious, as someone who is really familiar with the genesis of this scene from that time to now, the extent to which you feel like this band or this record in particular had an influence.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I will say that if I wear a City of Caterpillar shirt out in public, there's a good chance someone will stop me and be like, hell yeah, City of Caterpillar, because that does happen kind of a lot.
Yeah.
And in weird situations, someone will know the band and be like, hell yeah. And the thing is about that is usually if someone knows City of Caterpillar, they also know Majority Rule, Page 99, Darkest Hour, Crestfallen, Circle Takes the Square,
sure,
To Dream of Autumn, all of these other bands from that era. And it's great. Like, cause then it's a whole, and I can be like, yeah, I got a Page 99 tattoo and show it off or whatever. And
you ever have that moment where the person that you're talking to that recognizes it is not the person you thought? I went to work one time and I worked with this lady who's this delightful, like hippie mom. Like she's like 45, her kids are grown. She's a sweetheart, wonderful lady. And I walked in, I was listening to some very, very loud on my headphones. And she was like, that's the Sufferer and the Witness. And I went, how the fuck did you know that? and I hated myself for that response, because you shouldn't judge people, based on how they look and what their musical taste is going to be. But I was like, Susan, really? I was just like, wow, okay. And we had a great conversation about Rise Against.
Yeah.
Does this happen to you with this?
That's amazing, by the way. That is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, not so much. It's, I'll tell you, a lot of times, normally it's guys about my age and pigmentation and hairstyle that are like,
so like me too. Yes.
Yeah. It's guys that look exactly like you.
White guys with podcasts. Yes.
Yeah. Who are like, oh yeah, my band opened for them in fucking Boise or whatever. And it's usually that. It's usually that. But I will say one time I was at I believe it was a Michael's, because I don't go to Hobby Lobby, but I was getting something, and a teenage cashier saw I think she was wearing an Orchid shirt. Okay. It was either she was wearing an Orchid shirt or I was wearing a Page 99 shirt, but one of us was like, fuck yeah, like hell yeah to that shirt. And then it became a whole conversation, and I was like, oh man, I'm cool to this, like, I don't know, teenager. Like,
His 17-year-old.
It feels good to be cool to a teenager, because I never was when I was a teenager.
Man, I tell you something. There are a lot of people our age that get really bent out of shape, and the boomers are even worse for this.
Yeah.
Where they'll see some kid walking, and it used to piss me off too. My father's a musician, and he used to get bent out of shape. He'd see some like 17-year-old kid walking down the street in like a Pink Floyd t-shirt or something, and be like, man, get your own music. Like, not even like, don't like this, but like, you should be into something that's yours. Not something that I grew up with 40 years ago. And then of course there are the ownership assholes that are like, well, how many songs do you know? And whatever. But I used to get the same way. Like when I would see some 12-year-old wearing like a Nirvana shirt or something, like, oh, come on.
I definitely used to be the guy that was like, you weren't even alive when Kurt was alive, man.
And it's like, but then you grow up and you stop being an asshole and you go, well, no, that's really good. And I like to think of myself as being somebody like you, where I'd be really excited about that. But why do you think that is? Like, what about you as a musician and as a music lover do you think makes you want to share this music rather than keep it for yourself?
There's this thing that exists in fandom of all kinds: music, film, TV, comic books, fucking novels, poetry even has this, I believe.
Yes.
To some degree, and I can tell you live theater does, which is a real weird version of it. I don't know if ventriloquists or magicians have it, but there's this thing where, like, if you had a troubled time as a kid and you had a thing that got you through that, whether it was a comic book or a band or a movie or whatever it was that got you through this rough part of your life, it gets into your DNA, it gets into your sense of self, and it becomes a part of your identity rather than just a thing that you appreciate, because it's informed your growth. It's informed your sense of self to some degree. And especially in music, where there are genres and cliques and like affiliations and scenes, there's always going to be this like persona that gets wrapped up in it. And, because we're not really good at that in our society, we're not really good at being healthy about identity and sense of self and boundaries and, expression and communication. Like, that becomes a toxic thing when you express an ownership of it rather than like an affiliation with it or an appreciation for it. It becomes an ownership, and it becomes tied up with your sense of self. So if someone's critical of it, they're being critical of you. And it creates this territorialism and this like protection complex. This, it's mine, it's my precious,
Yes.
And it can mirror substance abuse or addiction in a lot of ways, as well as like what it does to your brain and the way you think about things, the way you take the world in. And I feel like that's what happens. It's just, it's a sense of self that goes sour because you're not sharing it. And it becomes like, well, if someone takes this away, if enough people like this, it's no longer special to me. And I think that it has to do with that. It's all wrapped up in that idea.
I think you're absolutely right. In fact, I've articulated very much the same thing about fandom of a variety of types, many of which you mentioned, because I've been involved in a lot of those, of those communities. And it's like, oh yeah, it's me, it's mine, and you have to prove yourself if you want to be a fan of this. And it's like, what is this, a Monty Python sketch? Fuck off! Like, leave me alone.
Like they didn't go through what I went through to like this. And it's really bad in punk because there's a lot of that. Like, we used to get our asses kicked. If I had a tattoo, I got beat up. If I had a mohawk, I got beat up because I lived in a town full of rednecks. And it's like, man, that sucks. I'm sorry that happened to you. But also, like, thank you for your service. Like, you being a part of that thing led to it not being as much like this 12-year-old's not going to get their fucking ass kicked for having pink hair now. And I'm sorry, that's a good thing.
And isn't it weird that exists in that way, in that community? But like, if you talk to somebody that was at Stonewall, they're not going to go, oh, I hope these kids are still dealing with what I dealt with.
Here's the thing though. You see that there too.
Oh,
I hate to tell you, but in the queer community, there are a lot of gatekeepers that are doing the exact same kind of shit where it's like, if you didn't get beat up for kissing your boyfriend in 1984, I don't want to fucking hear about it. And it's like, there's a lot of assuming that people are straight from their partnership, data. There's a lot of that shit. And there's I had friends sharing that kind of nonsense on Twitter just last year and being like, hey, you guys do understand that this is part of why people are afraid to open up with not only others, but themselves. Like, this is what keeps people in the closet, is this kind of shit.
And, and as much as it's like, it's a weird tonal shift to relate that to music, because obviously they're two very different things, but it's interesting that you frame it that way, because I think you're absolutely correct when we speak about gatekeepers in any capacity. My fiance is a fan of very specific music because she's only experienced a certain amount of it, because when she was young, she found things that she was into and people went, oh, well, that sucks. And you suck for liking it. Or she'd find like, oh, I like this song. And they go, well, that band's garbage.
Yeah.
Why would you listen to that? And it's like, that turns people off. Like,
yeah.
She had a thing where she didn't date musicians. Like, she nearly didn't date me because I was a musician, because she's like, fuck music, And I can't blame her for that. But, with all of that in mind, when we talk about, obviously what we're talking about here is the importance of music to people, because even if it comes out in a negative way, people relate to this. They own it. Like you said, they make it a foundational part of their lives. And I, based on our conversation, it sounds like at least part of this is pretty foundational for you as well. So I'm curious, and I hate to do it to you, because for whatever reason, we always seem to end up doing this to you, quantifying things, but I'm curious whether you have a go-to track or a favorite track on the record. You knew I was going to do this to you, Andy. I'm so sorry.
I knew it. I did know it. And I had an easy answer, but then I didn't. Because the thing is that, like, I honestly, Driving Spain Up a Wall might be my favorite City of Caterpillar song, and it's not on this album. But also, when I listen to this album, it is one of those things where I'm like, the two, if you ask me, okay, without listening, I have three standout tracks. The opening track, And You're Wondering How a Top Floor Could Replace Heaven, which is, again, it's the first track I heard off of this. It's definitely, like, even now, like, I sometimes get goosebumps listening to it. Like,
for the first track on a record, it is ambitious. It throws down a gauntlet, like Quentin Tarantino says, where, we're just saying we're big. That's what to my mind, that's what that track did for this record, for sure.
Yeah, it starts out with that, that it's like a fuse being lit. That it's like anxious, it's anxiety inducing.
It's setting up the
rhythmic.
It's setting up what is a very incredibly dense, what is it, 8 tracks on this album?
Yeah, it's seven.
But they're all like 9 minutes long. So it works out time wise to be an EP or an LP rather. And that's pretty incredible, because it's very, very dense material. Yeah.
And that opening track is so, like, the way it kind of starts simply and then layers and then layers and then layers, and it has these outbursts in it, and then these pullbacks and these little meanderings, but and it's also just like, it's angry, but it's sad. I think a lot of that, this album, it's angry, but it's also sad. And I think that, like, very few musicians, I think, or bands can, like, ride that line the way that City of Caterpillar does. But the other one is A Little Change Could Go a Long Way. That's the longest one, the one that, like, kind of, it's very cinematic. It's the most Godspeed You Black Emperor sounding. It's sort of, when you listen to it, it's almost like you can see, like, an epic battle starting to take place. It's just amazing. And then it falls into this amazing kind of driving groove. And then the last song, Maybe They'll Know Right Through, it's like a horror movie in a song. It's so good.
It's a really diverse set of soundscapes, and it's interesting that you mentioned cinematic and earlier theater, because I didn't get the opportunity to sit down and fully, to be honest, read all of the lyrics, because they're a little difficult to make out vocally.
Yeah.
even with good speakers and good headphones and stuff like that. Like, I understand that's the point.
And if you were listening, which version were you listening to? Was it the one on Spotify?
No, I actually pulled it from YouTube.
Okay. I'm pretty sure the version that's on Spotify, not to advertise for them, but I'm pretty sure that is the remastered version.
I looked for the remastered and I couldn't find it because to do my re-listen, I was actually, to be honest with you, running out of time. So I kind of grabbed the first one. I was like, I just want to reacquaint myself with these songs. It is a little difficult to make out, but lyrically, I went and read some of the lyrics, and I found it interesting that they are not lyrics that one would regularly associate with a song, because they don't rhyme. They are more freeform poetry than they are traditional lyrics, which is cool. And I was curious, because of the way that the album is structured, whether it is intended to be a narrative, like the way we would think of a concept album,
like a concept album,
or A Grand Don't Come for Free, or something like that, where it's telling a cohesive story.
Yeah, if I remember the liner notes of the original release of it, they didn't have. That's the other thing, is that the lyrics that I found last time I looked up the lyrics are not the lyrics that were in the liner notes. Like the liner notes for the original release of this record, which I believe was Robotic Empire put it out, but it wasn't full lyrics. And I was like, this word is not what he's saying there. Like, I know that, I can hear that this is not all correct, but the lyrics that are on there now. So like, it was only after the remastered version came out that I was like, oh shit, that's what he's saying in a lot of cases. But it is, it's poetry. It's poetry, and it's not
Absolutely.
stuff you would associate a lot of times with aggressive music. I mean, but it is also very emblematic of the music that was being made in this kind of a space at the time. And but I do remember in the liner notes, there's something, and it's driving me nuts because it's literally in the next room, but I'm not going to go get it. But there's a bit about the idea of loss and grief. And it's like a dedication, it's more of a dedication than it is any kind of like disclaimer, but it's sort of about, it's for people who have lost someone. And you can hear that in it. So yeah, maybe emotionally it's a concept album. Circle Takes the Squares record, As the Roots Undo, I still hold is a fucking narrative concept album, but that's a conversation a lot of people aren't ready to have, I feel like.
I can't even begin to speak to that, which is a conversation that I will be delighted to have with you once I sit down and listen to some of that. But I meant to mention, when you were talking about the idea that, don't forgive me, I just lost the link that I was looking for. We're gonna just bounce right on past that.
That's all good.
Sorry. I was reading a Vice article earlier about the band and about the choices that they made musically and stuff like that. And it was typical Vice, so it was very flowery and it was very verbose. But it was clear that the writer really, really loved this band the same way that you seem to, because he was like, I walked in one person and I walked in a different person. And I was curious if that was your experience. Well, I mean, you sort of did say it was your experience, but I was curious whether that experience leads you to revisit that album at particular times or in particular scenarios.
Yeah, it is. It's weird because there are a lot of records I don't revisit from this age of listening to stuff but this kind of music I do revisit, and it will just be like I'll get in a kick, where I'm like, oh, I want to listen to Emergency Numbers by Majority Rule right now, and I'm going to listen to it in its entirety, and then I get really into it and I'm like, oh fuck, well now I want to listen to this Circle Takes the Square demo, and shit, now I want to hear the hissing choir or whatever, like I want, because there's also like bootlegs and shit that the sites would put up on their blogs. So I would go down these rabbit holes with this kind of a music, with this kind of music. I know how to talk. Can you tell? But there's a lot of other music from that I was really into at that time that I find either difficult to re-listen to, or I kind of roll my eyes at. I'm like, oh, of course I was into that. I was an idiot, but this band, this record, it's always rewarding. Every time I listen to it, it's like, oh, the whole thing is one amazing song. and I listen to it all the way through. There's no skips. Oftentimes I'll listen to it again all the way through. Like I've got 2 different vinyls of it. I've got the original release and the remastered Repeater Records release. And I listen to them both depending on how I'm feeling sometimes. Like,
do you think you engage with it differently now as an older person than you did when you first heard it?
I don't think so. I think this is one of the very few things that I listen to, and it like puts me back. So there's a nostalgia factor to it. So that's a different level of engagement than it was in like 2002, 2003, when I was listening to it all the time. And that's the thing. This was a record I listened to all the time. When I was driving, when I was at work, when I was writing, when I was cleaning, when I was doing chores, when I was.
So it wasn't a specific, it was just like an all the time record.
Yeah.
Anytime record.
Yeah, it was. And maybe it was because I was emotional all the time back then. I don't know. But, I had friends that I would, we'd listen to, hey, we're going to get a bunch of beers and smoke some weed and fucking put on a bunch of records all night. And this was usually one of the records. Like, I think that's what it is. I just listen to it so often that like.
So it really pushes a lot of different buttons for you in the sense that it's nostalgic. It's endemic of a time in your life. It's also still relevant to you today. It's something that's it's comforting, but it's also something that you can listen to at any time.
Yeah. And I will say this, maybe I engage with it a little differently, purely in the sense that when I put it on for one reason, if I put it on because it's like, oh, I'm doing dishes and I just need something kind of driving and a little bit like, musically interesting to have on while I'm doing this like mindless task. Or if I'm listening to it because it's like, I want to sit down and write. Or if I'm listening to it because I'm feeling particularly angry or particularly sad, it will serve that purpose, but then it will bring in one of the other purposes. Like I put it on for one reason, and then I'm always enjoying it for another several reasons.
That makes a lot of sense. There are a number of records that I'm lucky enough to count in a list like that. They're not easy to come by, but if you listen to enough music, you can rack them up fairly easily.
Well, it's funny. Even when we first were talking about you having me on here, I wanted "Left and Leaving" by the Weaker Thans to be my record, and then fucking Danger came in and just snatched that out from under me.
Sure
and I
did.
was a little bummed, but you know what? I listened to that record again, and no shit. I love that album. That
it's
album will
really
always be. It will always be a Desert Island album for me. I've seen the Weaker Thans like fucking 7 or 8 times. Like, I love it. But re-listening to it, there were a couple of songs where I was like, that doesn't mean what it used to mean to me anymore. And there's a sadness to that. Like, there's a little bit of a like, and of course, most of the songs were like, oh yeah, it feels just as immediate as it always did. And there were songs that I was like, I appreciate this song more than I used to. But my relationship to that record had changed. It does,
that makes total sense because that happens when you get older. I was the world's biggest Smashing Pumpkins fan when I was 15 years old, and I always said that Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness was a masterwork. And I'm not wrong, but I'm not right.
Siamese Dream is better.
Siamese Dream is better. And as much as Melancholy was an interesting experiment, if it had been taken on by anyone but Billy Corgan, it would have been an interesting experiment. Instead, it was Journey into Narcissism featuring Billy and the rest. And it so sounds like that to me now at almost 40, having done music for the last 25 years, as compared to like me at 15 going, wow, I listened to Muzzle for the first time and it spoke to me.
Yeah, like, life kind of chokes a little bit of the earnestness out of you as you get older.
A little bit.
But it also chokes a little bit of the self-importance out of you. And I feel like, I don't know if you lose them in equal measure, but I do find that sometimes when I'm listening to something now that I really loved when I was a certain age, part of me is like, am I a little bit dead inside now? Or do I just not have patience for people self-mythologizing anymore?
Because there's a lot of that, and I suspect that you and I are fans of similar lyrical content.
Yeah,
and particularly we're fans of similar lyrical content back in the early 2000s. And I go, yes, you're still right, but Mr. Aaron Lewis, you are now 37 years old and you are singing songs about hating your dad. So I think it's time to evolve or die, my friend.
Oh yeah, I remember pop punk acts, in their 30s being like
I'm
singing
just
about
a kid.
school and girls, and it's like, what the fuck? Talk
Like
about
you
your
have a mortgage,
back.
man.
Talk
about your alimony you have to pay. What are you talking?
Yeah.
Yeah. And but sometimes these and I really like bands like City of Caterpillar, because they become these crystallized moments in history. And it's cool, as much as it's cool. And you mentioned that they've done reunion shows and stuff like that, and that's dope. But one of the things that you mentioned to me off mic when we were talking about this was the fact that they kind of just get together when they've got time to, like, hey, you guys want to go do a couple of shows? And that to me is just, that is the most rock and roll shit I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah. Like all these folks, they have other things going on. Some of them have moved to different cities and become parts of different scenes. Some of them have taken up different forms of expression, different artistic mediums, like started businesses, etc. Like they all aged. That's the thing, is that these bands, one of the things that afforded them this idea of like being a part of an underground, at that time. And, they got to influence a lot of bands all over the country. They got to be kind of like have a hand in a lot of scenes all over the place. And some scenes had been like, developing on their own. I don't want to say like Page 99 was a Johnny Appleseed. In a way they were, at least in VA, but like nationwide, they at least would, tour with or play shows with these other bands in local regional scenes that would then, kind of carry on from there in their own way. And, they weren't the first. Like Seisha came before, and Orchid came before, and Indian Summer, but I forgot my whole fucking point. See, this is the thing. I get too self-important with this.
No, it's not self-importance. It's what it is. And what I recognize it to be is you've ensconced yourself and sublimated yourself into a culture and a genre and a million subgenres of music that really matters to you. And that's kind of the whole point of this show, is like, I bring people on not to talk about music that they think is cool or that they think is going to be like, oh, let's talk about, I want to talk about the stuff that matters, because at the end of the day, that's what these people are doing this for.
Yeah. Okay. Exactly. So that's the thing. These guys, they do this because they love it. They do this because at the time they were 20 years old or 18 years old or 25 years old or whatever. And they start this band together, and then like they get together with some other friends and they play some bands, some other music together with other friends. And it becomes this scene, and everybody's working together. And sure, sometimes there's drama and sometimes it is a problem. Santa Fe, if somebody slept with the wrong person, it was like a shutdown on everything for like months. Because it was such a small fucking scene.
Toronto is not different.
But yeah, and I mean, honestly, even in LA, like,
oh yeah,
it's always a small world, right? It's always a small world. And that's the thing, is that it was always a small world for a lot of these bands. So they didn't get famous, and they didn't make, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars off of their music, but they made a lot of friends and they made a lot of connections. And they got to go back home and age as they would normally age, like starting businesses or working other jobs or finding other things to do. Some bands would drop out completely. Some bands would reunite or start other bands or move to New York and start a different band, or, start doing art full-time, like illustration or whatever. Like a lot of these guys, they just had normal lives after this. And when they start a band now, it's just like, yeah, we want to do this. And if we have a friend who runs a label, they'll put it out, or we'll do a reunion show at Fest, or we'll do a reunion show at, Best Friends Day or whatever. Like it's kind of chill, from what I understand.
Well, it has to be chill. I mean, to my mind, and, I was never much of a punk. I picked up an acoustic guitar as opposed to the electric. So like, but I look at it and I go, you can't sustain, because I wasn't a punk musician, but boy, did I listen to a lot of it. I was an angry young man, just like everybody else. But you can't sustain that energy, that fuck you kind of energy. No. You can't, you either burn out and die, or you become, addicted to something, or you let it go a little bit, like that stupid meme of Ian MacKaye and Henry Rollins that goes around every so often, where it's like, punk isn't dead, it just goes to bed at a more reasonable hour.
Yeah.
But they're not wrong.
No.
Rollins, Jello Biafra, MacKaye, all those guys are doing like spoken shows and shit now. And like, I know Rollins is famously intense, but most of those guys are just like, hey, you want to hear my story about when I was in this punk band? Come talk to me, you know?
Yeah. And I even remember back in 2002 or 2003 or whatever, there was this recording of Ian MacKaye saying like, oh, they have this music they call emo core. What? Isn't hardcore already emotional? Like, it was to that degree where he was like making fun of the terminology. And it's like, it's even like, okay, back boomer. Then, even back then we were like, well, we don't gotta be cute about this, you know?
Absolutely. Honestly, it's a remarkable scene, and it's not a place that I've ventured very, very much in my life, but I really feel like I got something out of the first time that I heard this record, which is, again, when you mentioned on another show, I went and checked it out independently, and I messaged you and I was like, this is fucking dope, because it is.
Yeah, it's so good.
I'm gonna post as part of the show notes, I'll post a link to the I'll see if I can find the remastered version to post, because that sounds like it's the better version. But I am more interested in delving into this genre than I ever have been, and I suspect that there are going to be people that are listening as well. So, do you have recommendations for further listening? And I know this is like, oh, how much time do you have, motherfucker? Because I got a spreadsheet, I'm sure, but.
Every band that put out an album from the DCVA scene between 1999 and 2005. I'm kidding. But also that there are a lot of bands in that scene and in that space that I could, obviously recommend by name. I want to say there's a Japanese band called Envy, and they are maybe the closest to City of Caterpillar, but they're a little bit more of the post-rock swell hardcore. Japanese band. They're called Envy, ENVY. Fucking amazing. They're incredible. I was very fortunate to see them live once, and it's mind-blowing. They're probably the closest, I think, to City of Caterpillar as far as the bands I'm going to recommend go. There's also Malady, which features members of City of Caterpillar.
And Page 99, right?
And Page 99, and also Ghastly City Sleep is more of the, like, it's shimmery. It's more of the slow, shimmery experimentation stuff that goes on in City of Caterpillar, but it's like just that. And it's all poetry, basically. But it's really good. It's very dreamy. It's very kind of like calming. Godspeed You Black Emperor, of course. Pianos Become the Teeth is their first couple releases. But I think my favorite band that has members of City of Caterpillar that was in their wake was Verse in Coma. And they only have one release. It's called Rialto. And the first track on it is one of my favorite songs of all time. And it's a great record. It's the record in general is great, but that first track is just, I don't know why I love it so much, but I do. It's probably my favorite post City of Caterpillar affiliated band. And I never got to see them live. I've seen a lot of these other bands live. I've seen City of Caterpillar live 3 times. I was at Page 99's supposed last show. Like, I've seen Majority Rule a number of times. Yeah, it was a supposed last show until years later when they did a reunion for Best Friends Day, and then just kept going after that. And they're great. They're great dudes. Their music's amazing. Like, I'll never not see them if I have the opportunity. Mm-hmm. But Verse in Coma, Rialto, and Envy are, I think, the two big recommendations.
So this is where you guys, listeners, go run, do not walk, and check out everything that Andy just said. Because if you haven't listened to him on his other music-related podcasts, let me tell you, the man knows what the fuck he's talking about. With that, where else can we find you? Where else can we find Andy Sell when he's not guesting on one of our Mirror Hit podcasts?
Or attempting to guest on one.
Or attempting to get. Look, I wasn't going to bring it up, man.
That wasn't. Yeah. That's 2 times I've fucked up now.
No, it's not your fault.
You can find me. Ghoul School, a horror history podcast. We're doing more episodes.
A few have just come out.
Yep. One has just come out, and I don't know when this is going up, but there might be another one by the time this goes up. There's also Look Good for the Boys, is a horror gossip podcast that I do with my friend Philip. It's a lot of fun. If you're into horror movies and gossip, then you'll like it.
It's a lot of fun. I've listened to it. It's a very different side of Andy, and it's one that I feel really privileged to have experienced. And if you guys are fans of Andy, you should definitely check it out.
It's a side of me I very rarely have ever gotten to kind of express before.
It's fucking terrific, man. I really like the show a lot.
Thank you. And then we have a final episode of the Music on Pop's Music Steve Earle season is going on.
That's been really good. It's been a lot of fun listening to you and Travis and Adam talk and learn about Steve Earle. He's been one of my biggest inspirations my whole musical career. So
he was always, just on the outside of my periphery. He's another one of those where it's like, where were you when Steve Earle was putting out all his music? I'm like, I was at a Page 99 show, man. I feel like I remember him from The Wire, but god damn, he's so good.
He is. You should read his autobiography to get a chance. It's really, really good. Hardcore Troubadour.
Hardcore Troubadour. I have a copy of it. Yeah,
it's so good. It's so interesting. What a fascinating life. And man, did that guy dodge a lot of bullets.
Yeah. Yeah, he fired a lot of bullets too.
And he sure did. And I mean, listen, it doesn't matter what you're listening to. You got to be listening to something. And thank you for listening to our stuff today. Thank you so much, Andy, for being here. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I'm really glad I got a chance to do this. Is the first time we've done a one-on-one.
Oh yeah.
Normally you're on with the boys. So this was really cool. We got to geek out a little bit on stuff that we don't normally get to talk about on the main show.
Awesome.
And we will absolutely do this again if you were inclined.
Yeah. I have a list of like 3 more records.
I know you have a never-ending list, and I am here for it because
and I don't think any of them are like in this space. None of them are hardcore or screamo. It's all different stuff.
Even the ones you sent me to narrow down, I was like, "Ooh, we could do that, or we could do that, or we could do," and that's really different and exceptional. So perhaps we'll do something completely different for you next time. In the meantime, thanks, friends, for joining us on this musical journey and for being a patron. You're paying us for this, and I appreciate it very, very much. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this week's episode. So feel free to get at me at Composers Pod or Alex James Tunes on Twitter. Like the man says, music is the glue of the world. It holds it all together. Without it, life would be meaningless. That's all for this week, friends. I have been Krueger, and this has been Krueger Records.